Taking sharp shots of stationary subjects is all very well, but what if your subject is moving towards you or away from you? In the time it takes to half press the shutter release to lock the focus, and then fully press it to take the shot, the subject might have moved a metre or more closer to the camera. If you're using a wide-angle lens at a very narrow aperture, this might not be a problem, as almost everything in the frame should be sharp, from the foreground to the distant background. However, if you're using a longer lens at a narrow aperture, the depth of field might only be a few centimetres. If this is the case, anything closer to the camera that doesn't fall within this very narrow band of focus will be blurred. One way around this is to pre-focus on a point that you know your moving subject will be passing through, and then fire off a burst of shots in continuous drive mode as the subject moves past this point. So long as the subject is the same distance from the camera as the point you've focused on, the chances are that at least one of the frames will be in focus, assuming of course that you've set a high enough shutter speed to freeze the motion. But there is a better way to ensure sharp shots of subjects moving towards you at speed, and that's to use so-called focus tracking. Focus tracking, also called AI servo autofocus on Canon cameras and continuous autofocus on Nikons, continuously refocuses as the subject moves towards you by trying to predict where the subject will be from one split second to the next. As with single shot AF, it's activated by half pressing the shutter release. So long as you keep the shutter release half pressed, the camera will continuously refocus on whatever is underneath your chosen AF point. Now it can take a few frames for the system to lock onto the movement of the subject, which is why it's best to set your camera to continuous or burst mode when using focus tracking. In this mode, the first 2 or 3 frames might be slightly soft, as the camera works out the speed and trajectory of the subject. But once it's locked onto the subject, every frame should be pin sharp. The key is to ensure that the autofocus point you've selected remains over the subject the whole time. If the subject strays outside of the area covered by your chosen AF point, the system will try to refocus on whatever is covered by this AF point, usually the background. If it helps, think of it as a missile homing device. Once you've locked onto the target, the trick is to track the subject so that it stays under your chosen AF point the whole time. That said, some models feature additional focus modes, which will continue to track the subject even when it does stray away from your selected AF point. But it's still a good idea to track your subject as accurately as possible, not least to keep it in the same place in the frame. It's also worth bearing in mind that your camera's central focus point may be faster and more accurate than the points around the edges, especially in low light. So unless you've got a high-end camera with multiple high sensitivity AF points, it's usually best to stick to the central focus point whenever possible. If you've never used focus tracking, you'll be amazed at how good it is once you've got the hang of keeping the selected AF point over the target. Where it can come unstuck is that it's sometimes hard to tell whether or not the shutter release is half pressed. And if you accidentally press too hard, you run the risk of firing off a burst of frames too early. To get around this, some SLRs have a dedicated AF button on the back, which can be operated by the thumb of your right hand. This helps to keep focusing and firing completely independent. And critically, you don't need to half press anything. You just hold down the back AF button with your thumb to autofocus, keep holding it down as you track your subject's movement, and then fire off a burst of frames at the peak of the action, again with the back AF button still fully pressed. Not all SLRs feature a dedicated AF button on the back, but on most models, so-called back button focusing can be set using a custom function, often by turning the exposure lock button into an autofocus button instead. See your camera's instruction manual for details.